Hello, history students. Um, we're here kind of wrapping up finally. It might not have seemed like a long time just because of our, different situation, but we're wrapping up the 60s um, and going a little bit into the 70s as well. But our textbook has about four chapters, mostly about the 60s. We have, a chapter about politics with JFK and Lyndon Baines Johnson. We have a chapter about civil rights movement and a chapter about the Vietnam War, and then finally a chapter that's called the Era of Social Change. And so, yeah, it's a lot of stuff. So these are all going, these things are all going on at the same time. And as we talked about the Vietnam War, certainly huge changes that went on with the counterculture protest movement to Vietnam, which we'll address a little bit in this. I'm not going to spend as much time on this chapter. I feel like we need to move on and try to finish up this year. So this is going to be short, and we're just going to kind of cover the highlights of this, and then move on to study other eras and finish up American history for the year. Okay, so let's go through this. Let me see here. I'm sorry. I feel like my picture is on top of Cesar Chavez's head here. Maybe that makes it better. Okay, sorry about the technical difficulties. I hopefully got them worked out a little bit. So here we go. I want you to see this kind of big idea here. This is the main thing that we need to make sure we know kind of from this chapter, is that activism and changes started by the civil rights movement inspired others to change society. The 1960s particularly, when people look back, I mean, sometimes it's just used as a synonym for change, or an era of change. And so it is just known for massive changes in society. It is, sometimes synonymous with things like drug use. And people would be like, oh, it was the 60s, which means it was okay to totally flaunt convention, the way things have been done before, and to, do things differently. And kind of from a historical perspective, we look at that and we say the first big change that it seemed like society faced, starting in the 50s, was the civil rights movement. And it led other people to rise up with their own causes and demand changes. Some of these good, some of these not as good. So it was a revolution in a lot of ways socially, and there was plenty of good and plenty of bad as well. So I don't want to be the kind of person. Some people look back and be like, oh, the 60s messed everything up. Other people look back at the 60s and act like it was a golden age of, hope, and the world was going to be so much better had we listened to the hippies. I don't think either of those perspectives is historically correct, nor is it theologically or biblically accurate. But certainly, you have to look back at the 60s and say, like Bob Dylan, the times were changing. It was just a time of great amount of change. So we're just going to look at some kind of activist, and then going to look at some things, some changes in society. First of all, I think it would be important to know the United Farm Workers Organization, led by Cesar Chavez. This was basically a union of migrant workers, of Mexican American workers, who for years and years had really faced, large amounts of discrimination. Never really had the kind of wages that white workers had. Didn't have unionization, didn't have kind of representation to help them earn better wages. And the reality is a huge amount of produce, especially coming out of California, produce was grown. It was harvested by Latin American workers, and so you see this organization to unionize these farm workers. and in a very similar way that Martin Luther King Jr. led for there to be the end of segregation, Cesar Chavez led there to be greater rights for Mexican American workers, and by doing the same kind of things, boycotts, and they would go on strike, and they advocated that people stop buying produce, and it led to change, and it led to greater pay and things like that. So you see, kind of a very similar story as you do with the civil rights movement. You also have movements like and I'm not going to go through all of these, the Indian American movement fighting for greater rights, as well as assistance to Native Americans. The National Organization for Women, called NOW, great name, National Organization for Women, so the acronym spells out NOW. They actually, this was a women's rights movement, as you can tell. They actually attempted an amendment to the Constitution, an amendment that actually passed and was signed into law by Congress, but was never ratified by all the states, or by enough states. And so the Equal Rights Amendment, as it was called, it's not part of the Constitution. But you saw this huge movement toward women's rights, and things like equal pay in the workplace, and those kinds of things. Interesting kind of historical side note as we kind of get into the changes when we talk, later on. The Equal Rights Amendment was something that started to kind of polarize conservatives and liberals, and you start seeing these terms really come on in the 60s, as to mean kind of what we use them to mean. Conservatives, people who are wanting culture not to change very much. Conservatives who are wanting the government not to keep on making new laws and telling people what to do, but generally stay out of their business. And then liberals who are wanting the government to do things like protect people's rights and create new laws that are intended to help people. Phyllis Schlafly is a conservative woman who actually campaigns against the Equal Rights Amendment. And the reality is that with things like the Equal Rights Amendment, with a lot of causes for women's rights, there were plenty of women on the other side that used their voice to speak out against these changes that they perceived as liberal. And so you have kind of this tension in society, and what we are seeing right now, and we'll talk about this more with next chapter, but we really are seeing kind of a lot more of modern American politics, where there's this, Democratic Party that's more liberal, and Lyndon Baines Johnson and Great Society kind of stuff, Medicare, Medicaid, all that kind of stuff is kind of more on the liberal side. The Equal Rights Amendment, those kinds of things, and then a Republican Party that's more of the conservative Republican Party, and that you start seeing that those parties really identify as that in particularly in the 70s as we move out of the 60s. And then so big picture though, a lot of groups wanted to have the same kind of activism and the same kind of social impact and social change that the African American civil rights movement had. So there's marches for women's rights, there's marches for Native American rights, there's protest and boycotts for Latin American rights. There are even, I don't have this on the PowerPoint, but there were protests for gay rights that date back to the 60s. So you're seeing this kind of social push for social change, and that it is this huge time of change, and you start seeing this we can call them the hippies, you can call them the counterculture, but you start seeing a a segment of society. It was never everybody. It was never a majority of people, but it was a visible segment of society that wanted to basically throw off the way society had always been. You know, I put, famously people talk about sex, drugs, and rock and roll when it comes to, that this lifestyle, the counterculture, and it is throwing off, the hippie movement and the counterculture movement really are kind of throwing off the restrictions of normal society. Society had taught for years, that sex had to do with, a married man and a married woman. They were married to each other, and this was the way things should be, and this gets thrown out the window. Drug usage. I mean, drug usage had been going on. It's not like this had never happened before, and you could even buy drugs like opioids and at one point in time cocaine in the early 1900s. But society never approved it, and but in the 1960s, there's this group in society that really not just looks the other way on it, but celebrates the use of drugs. And a lot of these are tied into the kind of the youth culture. These are the baby boomers, and again, it's not every baby boomer, but right, their parents went off and fought in the war, and there's this large segment of them in society that is just willing to change everything and change all the rules. And you guys have probably heard of Woodstock during this time, the large festival, music festival. And so a lot of rock and roll, the Beatles music. If you listen to the Beatles, the later they get in their career, the more drugs they do, the weirder they sound. And like I said, it's not just that drug use wasn't exactly new, but it was being celebrated is what makes and used more than had been in the past. But this is what makes the hippie movement and the counterculture so different. A lot of historians also use the term that these things totally go in connection with each other, but the sexual revolution and the hippie culture, the counterculture, embraced a totally different sexual ethic. I mentioned that previously, but part of this was the birth control pill. So sex becomes much less removed from procreation and marriage. Roe versus Wade and the legalization of abortion, which happens in 1973, which is in some ways kind of a culmination of this sexual revolution, to where now it is legal to take the life of the unborn. And so sex becomes more and more removed from procreation and from marriage. And so it is a totally very different view of sex that is not Christian. It is not biblical. It's not healthy. And it is the view of sexuality that our culture, by and large, still holds. I mean, from the 60s, the changes in the 60s have even, grown over time and become embedded in our society. One last thing to say about the counterculture that I don't have on the PowerPoint, and I should, is a lot of this, and we talked about this before, but a lot of this is all connected also to, the war in Vietnam. So yes, there are all these changes. There's changes in the civil rights movement. There's women's rights. There's Latino rights. There's gay rights even. There's, new kinds of music. But a big part of this is that the Vietnam War and the perceived pointlessness of it all really made people distrust the establishment, distrust their government, distrust their leaders. I mean, when you have leaders that will send you to die in a war that you think is pointless and stupid, you start seeing this break from this lack of trust in the establishment, in the leadership of the country. And so the counterculture movement really does go hand in hand with that as well. And the protest of the war, a lot of Americans went from protesting for black equality and the civil rights movement to protesting, against the Vietnam War, and um, and becoming more radical even against their government, right? There's a little bit of, we're bucking the establishment if we're pushing against segregation, because segregation was the establishment, but now it's even more bucking the establishment because we are pushing against our country's, and our country's decision to fight the war. We're at odds against our soldiers, and society was just very, very polarized. And it's no surprise that in this time, as we've talked about, there are many, many prominent assassinations. It was just a very tense time for a lot of people. The radicalness of the counterculture movement, the massive changes of society that they kind of represented, to where there apparently were no rules anymore. There were no rules to sex. There were no rules to behavior, to dress, people wearing who knows what, doing who knows what. It's just all rules are thrown out with the hippie movement and the counterculture. Most people in society weren't about that. Most people weren't willing to just be like, oh yeah, we're just going to go along with that. And this is where you start seeing in the 60s, late 60s, and really in the 70s, a kind of, we always see like pendulum swings, and you start seeing a pendulum swing against that. That's a conservative response. Richard Nixon's election in 68, what he called the silent majority supporting him, the majority of the country that's not hippie people. What some historians call the new right, which is this new conservatism that rises up in the 70s, and that's calling for kind of moral values and less government control, and at the same time support for efforts against communism and rejection of the cultural revolution or the sexual revolution, the counterculture. The new right kind of embraces all those things and is kind of this counter and this opposite of the way so much of society had gone up until that point. We'll talk about the kind of conservative movement more, particularly when we get to things like Ronald Reagan. But you start seeing a push against a lot of those things, even in the 70s, as we get out of the 60s. This is brief, and I just kind of wanted to hit some of the highlights, the main things that you guys need to know moving forward. So anyway, this is our lesson for today, and you guys have a good day.